Okay, today's daf is Daf Sadi Gimel. We are getting near the end of the Masechet. Looking forward to the upcoming Siyum. I hope everybody's excited. We are going to start now. I'll just do some quick review of what we saw yesterday. We were talking, once we saw the Mishnah about the roofs and really the courtyards, the small one opening up to the bigger one, the three rabbis came along and said, you can infer from the Mishnah that the people living in the big courtyard that opens up to the small one, and it has, remember, those gipufim. You can view, when you're in the big courtyard, you can see the sides, the walls from the sides. Therefore, I'm going to say that they kind of take over the small one. Okay, the small one is considered, you can view it in different ways. The small one is considered secondary to the big one. Why is it secondary? Because remember, from the perspective of the small one is entirely what we call parutz bimlo'o. It's entirely open to the big one. When you're walking from the small one to the big one, you don't see any walls or anything. It looks like it's just one continued space. Therefore, the big space kind of takes over the smaller space, okay? Which means, now then, there are all sorts of stringencies because of this. We basically said, right, or it could go both ways, really. But what bothered Abaye were really the stringencies, that if you planted, if you remember, in the big courtyard, you had a vineyard and you wanted to plant in the small courtyard, other crops, you're not allowed to do that without a distance of 4 cubits. According to them, you're not allowed to do it at all, because anywhere in that space is considered, and now this is kind of even one step farther, it's considered absorbed by the bigger space, as if it's right next to each other, even though it's not really right next to each other. And that's what we were discussing yesterday. Some things could be right next to each other and yet not problematic, like we saw with the excrement, for example. You could be right next to it. By the way, the Shulchan Aruch mentions that it's as long as you don't smell it. Okay, this is a good example. I told you about my street. I didn't smell what was next to me, but it was right next to me, right? It didn't matter that it was maybe dried out and didn't have a smell anymore, but it was right next to me. It doesn't really matter. But in this case, we basically say, as long as you don't smell it, even if you're right next to it, this is the reverse case, where if we come from the perspective of the smaller one doesn't have any rule on the bigger one, because the smaller one is kind of subject to the big one. So therefore, we don't view it in the other direction, okay? And therefore, we're going to say, right, now, here comes Abaye's question. If you have the big one, we're going to say, basically swallows up the little one, and the little one is considered as if it's right next to the big one, you have something very strange. You have walls between the big one and the small one. It's specifically from the big one that you see the walls. Those walls, instead of what walls generally do is they separate, those walls consider them right next to each other. Those walls consider the smaller one absorbed into the bigger one, which means that we end up with walls that instead of separating, they're joining. Follow how that's an issue? And that's Abaye's question. He says, how could walls possibly join as opposed to, right, and then forbid? He uses the lashon of le'esor, it forbids. But really what he's saying is those walls join those two sections together, because since the bigger one has walls and the smaller one doesn't, smaller one is considered absorbed into the bigger one. So because the bigger one has walls, that means all of a sudden the smaller one is as if it's right next to the bigger one, even though it's not. So here the walls bring us together rather than separating, and there are walls in between the two, so it doesn't really make sense. So we had a question, we answered it. I'm not going to go back to that, but we're going to start now. We're going to have 4 questions against Abaye. Today we're going to see 3 of them because we saw one yesterday. We're starting from the second to last line on Sadi Bet and Bet. Amar le Rava Abaye. What do you mean we don't have such a case? We do, sure we do. It was said, Sikech al gabeach sadra. Okay, here we're going to have, today you're going to have to use, you don't have to, but it will be much more useful if you use the pictures. It's a little hard to see without the pictures. We have a sukkah. Sukkah, if you remember, needs 3 walls. So let's say you have 2 walls of house. Okay, it doesn't say this in this text, but Rashi explains it. That obviously that's what we mean. You put schach on top of a portico. Portico generally has no walls, but your portico is up against it's usually something with just a cover, a ceiling, and it's next to 2 walls. It's up against 2 walls. So you basically you put schach on top. If sheyesh la ptsimim. Okay, what are ptsimim? Ptsimim are wooden beams. Okay, so now, if you have a wooden beam, Rashi says all it has to be is a tefach wide. because sukkah wall can be a tefach wide. There's a debate about this, if I remember correctly, but let's assume we hold it's tefach wide. So if you have, again, two walls, you can see it very easily in the picture 329, you have two walls, you have a ceiling in between with schach on it, and then you have these wooden beams on walls 3 and 4. It doesn't really have to be on 3 and 4. It could even be on wall 3 because all you need is 3 walls. But if you have a beam coming down, going in the other direction of the walls, perpendicular to the walls, then that psimin can create a wall because it's a tefach wide, and it's kshera. The sukkah's a perfectly kosher sukkah. So far, this has nothing to do with our issue. But what happens? And here comes his question. Ilu hishva psimeha. Okay, what does that mean, hishva psimeha? It means if you flatten out the psimim so they're not noticeable. How would you do that? Let's say you built a wall between, let's say you have psimim on wall 3 and wall 4. They jut out a little bit from the walls of your house. Now, you're going to basically create a wall that's perpendicular to the psimim, just like the walls of the house were, parallel to the walls of the house. But now it's very hard to describe this in words. The picture is much better in 330. But in case you don't have the picture, I'm going to try to explain it in words. What you basically have is you now have what it looks like is a much thicker wall than you had before. You have the wall of the house, and now you have another wall in it, right? A tefach in, or let's assume the psimim were a tefach wide. So a tefach in, you build another wall. At this point, what's the issue? You no longer have wall 3 and 4 because you can't see the psimim anymore. It's hishva psimah. That means you flatten them out, because now when you're sitting inside the sukkah, all you see are 2 open sides entirely and 2 closed sides entirely. You only have 2 walls because the psimim are now absorbed into this thick wall that you've built. So now what do you see here? Building another wall, right? Here you've made a mechitza. The mechitza now basically means there's less of a mechitza, right? You've kind of created one mechitza to cancel out another mechitza. But what you're basically saying, again, this you'll see why it's not really a question, because in the end it's really canceling. But the idea is here you're adding a mechitza and you're really getting rid of it, right? You're ending up in a worse situation when it comes to mechitza, because now you no longer have 3 or 4 walls. So Amarle Abaye says, first of all, he says 2 things. Lididik shera, I think this is fine. Why would this be a good sukkah? He says, because I think that in this kind of case, you'd say, Pitikra yored v'sotem. Remember that? You can view the ceiling as if it drops down. So the fact that you have a ceiling here in the Achsadra, we can view the sides as if they drop down. So walls 3 and 4 are imaginary walls, but they're imaginary walls. So they work. But Liditcha, you disagree with me about this issue. We're going to see this all in a different sugya. Not today. You disagree with me about this issue. But anyway, you can't question me from this because siluk mechitzoti. This is again what happened by adding this extra mechitza, just like in the previous case we saw yesterday, you're basically canceling out the original mechitza of the psimim. So it's not a case of adding mechitza reduces mechitza. In other words, that this mechitza makes it worse. No, this mechitza ruined a previous mechitza you had, and that's why. But in our case, we weren't talking about a mechitza ruining some previous mechitza. There, we just had the Chatzer Gdola has a mechitza, and because of that, it absorbs the smaller one in it, and it's as if there's no wall there. So that's what I have issue with. This is not the same thing. Question number 3, which I'll already tell you, the first 3 questions are all answered in the same manner. The 4th question is going to be a little bit different. Amalei Rabba Barav Natan Abai. V'lo matzinu mechitza li'isur. So now he says again, what do you mean we don't have a mechitza li'isur? You see, different people keep questioning him. V'hatanya, here's a braita, and I'll prove it to you. I don't know why they didn't give a picture for this. It would have been easier with a picture. The Schanstein has a good picture if you have that. Maybe the Koran also, I can't recall. But if you have a picture, great, look at it. Otherwise, I'll describe it to you. V'hatanya, bayit shechetzio mekura v'chetzio eina mekura. What if you have a house? Part of the house has a ceiling, part of the house is open, doesn't have a ceiling. Now, what did we say about kilayim? We're back to kilayim. You can't put vineyard right next to crops. What if there's a wall in between? If there's a physical wall in between, right? Normally you need to leave 4 cubits of space. If there's a wall in between, you can plant on one side of the wall a vineyard, on the other side of the wall crops. It doesn't make a difference. So what if you have a house that has half of it has a ceiling, half of it doesn't have a ceiling? What do we say in this case? Again, using our principle, pitikra yored v'sotem. It's as if we have walls, imaginary walls coming down. It's as if your house is split into 2, because what this actually is the would make the most sense in terms of Pitikra Yoreh V'Sotem. My house is split in two. I have one part with a ceiling, one part without a ceiling. Those are two distinct spaces. So we view the walls as if they drop down, which means, right, where I have a ceiling, which means that if I wanted to, Kfanim Kan, if there were Kfanim, let's say on the inner part, the part that had a ceiling over it, and there was none on the right, and then on the other side, Mutar Lizra Kan, I can plant right next to it. I don't need to leave 4 amot of distance because our imaginary wall that drops down from the ceiling separates. But ilu hishvad kiruyo asul. But what if I took that ceiling and I extended my ceiling? Now here's something a little bit strange. They're considering this. They treat the ceiling like a mechitza. And what they're basically saying is if I added a mechitza here, which is basically instead of my ceiling ending here, I added another ceiling next to it and I extended my ceiling all the way. Now what happens? I no longer have an imaginary mechitza in the middle. I'm now considered one whole house. I can't plant now vineyard over here and crops over there because now there's no longer any separation. So here, what do you see? That by adding a mechitza, I've again made things come together rather than separate. So Amrle, again, Abai is going to answer. I already told you this. He was going to answer this. Hatam silut mechitzotu. Again, this is a case where by building an extra ceiling, even if you would maybe call it a mechitza, a separator, but in this case, it got rid of the imaginary mechitza that existed before because now there's no longer an edge of a ceiling in the middle because you've gotten rid of that. So again, it's a case where you've canceled out a mechitza. So in other words, Abai keeps saying, every case you've brought me is a case where basically you're saying, I'm bringing a mechitza, but I'm using it to cancel out a previously existing mechitza. And that's why. That's not what I was talking about, though. That's not our situation. And again, he still disagrees with the other rabbis. Here comes question number 4. Shalach le Rav ala Abaye biyad Rav Shmaya bar Ze'eri. He sent the question through somebody else. V'lo matzinu mechitza li'isur. Bahatanya, it says in a Braita. Here's going to be a review of a sugya that we saw about kilayim and different sizes of fields that one could plant in different formations. Yesh b'mechitzot hakerem lahakel ulahachmir. There's sometimes where walls in a vineyard cause leniencies, meaning this is what we already saw, that if you have a wall, you can plant on one side of the wall a vineyard and exactly on the other side crops without any separation. But, and that's going to be the part that they're going to question Abai with, they also can sometimes be lahachmir. Okay, they're going to make you need to be even more distance, which again is going to show you mechitzot are lahachmir, right? They are, again, they can forbid you. They can create situations where you're considered actually closer together. So ketzad, how does it work? So first they're going to explain the first case, which is very easy to understand because we already explained it. Kerem hanatua adikar mechitza. If you have a vineyard planted up until a wall, zorea miikar mechitza va'elach. On the other side of that wall, you can already start planting. It doesn't make a difference. She'ilu ein sham mechitza, and here you see why it's a leniency, because if there was no wall, marchit daled amot v'zorea, right? You'd have to plant 4 amot away. You'd have to make a distance. V'zeu mechitzat hakerem lahakel. Ulahachmir ketzad, how can it be lahachmir? Hayam mashuch min hakotel 11 ama, which really means up until 12. Okay, it says 11, but it really means up until 12. If your vineyard was up to 12 away, meaning less than 12 away from the wall, lo yavi zera l'sham. Basically, because you have a wall, normally it's 4 amot, but because there's a wall, it's going to mean that you're going to have to be 12 cubits away in order to be able to plant. Okay? So we don't yet know why. We're going to see why in a minute, or 2 minutes or 3 minutes. But the point is that having a wall makes it as if you're closer, okay? And as if you're going to have more of a stringent law, which again means mechitza li'isul. Shilmale ein mechitza, and here he proves it, because if there wasn't a mechitza, mechitza l'namot v'zorea, right? All you'd have to do is 4 amot. And here all of a sudden the mechitza is making your life worse, okay? So, V'zoi mechitzat hakerem lachmir ulahakel. And this would be the case of mechitzat hakerem lachmir ulahakel. That was all a Braita. Now, Abai has an interesting reaction. He says to him, he has a very long answer. He says, Amrle v'litamech otva mimatnitin. Why did you question me from a Braita? You should have questioned me from the Mishnah. Okay, this is a classic. If you have a choice, Braita, Mishnah is always stronger than Braita because it's the one that made it into the book, whereas the Braita didn't make it into the Mishnah. So if you had this question, you should have just asked me from the Braita, from the Mishnah. Okay, now he's going to read the Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that we already learned. Ditnan. Karachat hakerem. Okay, remember this? A bald space in the middle of a vineyard. Beit Shammai omrim. Now the whole question is, we're going to have karachat hakerem and machol hakerem. We're going to have a vineyard. Okay, I'll already pull up the pictures. But right now the Mishnah isn't going to explain, so I'm not going to explain yet. We have a vineyard that's planted in a big square with a big empty square in the middle. That's karachat, because it's like a bald spot in the middle of the field. And the question is, how big does this bald spot need to be in order to allow planting a field in the middle of crops? Or machol hakerem, which we talked last time, it's about dancing. You dance around in a circle, let's say, or dance around something. So we have the kerem is in the middle, it's the reverse, and we have a wall on the outside. And you want to know how much space do you need in order to plant between the vineyard and the wall? This case is going to be exactly like the Braita, because it's how much space between a vineyard and a wall. So let's read it inside. Karachat hakerem. We have a machloket Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel in both these cases. Beit Shammai omrim, kaf dalet amot. 24 cubits you need. You need a space of 24 by 24 in order to be able to plant. Ubeit Hillel, right? If you want to plant crops in the middle, like wheat or something. Ubeit Hillel omrim, tet zayin ama. You need 16 cubits. We're not going to understand yet why. We'll understand in a minute when the Mishnah explains. Machol hakerem, this is like a topic sentence. So karachat hakerem, that's the machloket. Machol hakerem, Beit Shammai omrim, tet zayin ama, Beit Hillel omrim, yud bet ama. So according to Beit Shammai, it's 16. And according to Beit Hillel, it's 12 you need. This is the exact same 12 we saw in the Braita. So let's understand. Ezohi karachat hakerem, this the Mishnah explains to us. Kerem shecharav emtzaito, you have nothing in the middle. Im ein sham tet zayin ama lo yavi zera l'sham. Okay, now they're just explaining Beit Hillel. Okay, in Beit Shammai you just have to add another 8 each, another 8 to the first one, another 4 to the second case. But let's explain. If you don't have 16 cubits, you can't do it. Why? Hayu sham tet zayin ama. How does it work? If there's 16, why does it work? Because noten lo kedei avodato. If you remember, in between the vineyard and the field, you need 4 cubits. Why do you need 4 cubits? Because you need space for the oxen and the plowshare to basically go around in order to allow the plowing. For that, you need 4 cubits of space. V'zorea et hamotal. And then you can basically, once you leave 4 cubits on either side, so you need to go around in a square shape, that would be 4 and 4 is 8. So you need 8 cubits of that. And then you need another 8 cubits of the space to plant, because anything less than 8 cubits by 8 cubits is not enough to plant, basically. It's not significant, so we're not going to allow it. Like nobody plants that small a space. So therefore, if it's already 16, we have the 8 where you plant, and the 8, which is 4 on either side, where you have for the oxen to go. According to Beit Shammai, you would need 16 by 16 in the middle. That anything less than 16 by 16 is not significant. And then you need 4 on either side, which will get you to 24. That's why he says 24. Hayu sham tet zayin ama. Sorry, I went back. Okay. Ezohi machol hakerem. Now let's go to the next case. Okay, we're 6 lines from where the lines get wide. So now why do we get to 12? Ben hakerem lagader. Okay, you need ben hakerem lagader. You need machol hakerem is the space between the vineyard and a wall. She'im ein sham yud bet ama lo yavi zera l'sham. Okay, if it's not 12, you can't plant. Hayu sham yud bet ama. Again, we're talking only according to Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai would say 16. Noten lo kedei avodato v'zorea et hamotal. Okay, so now what's the issue? If there's yud bet, then you have kedei avodato, 4 between the kerem and where you're planting, 4 to plant. Okay, a strip. If you have a long strip like this, it's fine. 4 is enough width for Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai needs 8. That's why they get up to 16. So 4 plus 4 according to Beit Hillel is 8. And then you need another 4 from there to the wall. Okay? And then you can plant the rest. So now again, you end up with the fact that there's a wall here. If you didn't have a wall, what would you say? All you need is 8. You need 4 of space from the kerem to where you're planting and 4 to plant. But all of a sudden there's a wall that makes us require 12. So basically what Abaye says to him is, if you were going to question me from a source, you should have questioned me from this Mishnah and not from the Braita. Okay, that's his claim. Now, he hasn't yet answered. All he said so far was he almost gave him better ammunition to fight against him, right? He said, you even have a Mishnah that agrees with you. But now he's going to explain why. Hatam in the Mishnah, lav hainu tama. Now, what's the reason in the Mishnah why you need this 12? He's going to basically explain it's not the wall. The issue with the wall is not because it's a mechitza or the gader, the fence. It's not because it's a mechitza and midim mechitza. It's a whole different reason. So let's see why. I see before I continue, someone asked about Beit Shammai's extra 4. He just thinks that a size necessary for planting is 8 instead of 4. He thinks you need, if you're going to plant a strip of crops, according to Beit Hillel, anyone could plant something 4 cubits wide. That's already significant. Beit Shammai says that's not enough to plant unless it's 8. That's not really going to be, nobody plants less than 8 wide. So they want it to be 8 wide, which means again, 8 wide, 4 on one side, 4 on the other, that gets you to 16. Okay, and the same with the square in the middle. His square is just a bigger square. Again, Beit Shammai thinks that your minimum amount that a person will plant is a bigger size. That's why his shirim are always bigger. But there's no difference in terms of the logic. So now they say, he says like this, Hatam lav hainu tama, the reason there, isn't it because the kol daled amot, now first he's starting with the side on the vineyard. Why do you need the 4 cubits between the vineyard and the crops? Because kol daled amot legabe kerem, avodata kerem, right? The part near the vineyard is because you need the oxen to go around with the plow. Legabe gadel, but what's the reason by the fence? It's not because there's a mechitza here. It has nothing to do with the fact that there's a mechitza. A mechitza only helps when it comes to laws of kilayim as we described. But what's the issue? Why do you have to distance yourself from the wall or from the fence 4 cubits? Kevan delo mizdan afuke mefkar lehu debene afkure mefkar lehu. He says, since you don't plant there. Now, why won't you plant there? What's going to happen if you plant next to your fence or your wall? Imagine your wall is stuck in the ground. If you start plowing, you're going to move the ground and the foundation of your wall is going to weaken and eventually your wall might fall down. So nobody goes near a wall to plant. Nobody plows near a wall. So therefore, that's why you have to leave 4 distance from your wall, but not because the wall is some sort of boundary, mechitza, separation. No, it's just a technicality. You don't want to go anywhere near there. That's why mefkar lehu. Basically, right, we're going to ignore this aspect, okay, because it's just not important. And therefore, debene bene, and the part in between, I ka'arba chashivan, I lo chashivan. And then the 4 in the middle is just a matter of chashivut, importance, right? Anything less than 4 is not considered significant. No one's going to plant in that kind of space. And again, Beit Shammai will say that needs to be 8. So basically, instead of saying this time it's siluk mechitzot, he's saying it's not siluk mechitzot. It's just not mechitza at all. It's just a technicality with the wall that no one's going to end up planting near that wall. And that's why you need the space. Nothing to do with the mechitza. Now we're going to have a new law. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda, okay, so that ends our discussion. We basically ended up with these 3 rabbis say that the bigger courtyard absorbs the smaller, and it's as if they're in the same space, okay, and closer than they actually are, right? Whereas the reverse doesn't hold true from the smaller to the bigger. Then we had Abaye who disagreed with that. People brought questions on Abaye. We answered them. Abaye answered them all. But in the end, we're left with 2 approaches, it seems. Now, Rav Yehuda is going to come and build on the approach of the other rabbis. And he's going to give us a different case. This goes back to the beginning of the Masechet. We learned about people who come, they end up landing somewhere for Shabbat, a group of people, and they put up, they don't have time to build proper walls. They put up either beams standing up or ropes going horizontally. Normally, a wall needs to be both horizontal and vertical, filled in. In this case, they build walls. I'll pull up a picture so you can see. They build here, they show vertical beams. Okay, they build this kind of a weak structure. It's considered weak walls. Now, they're planning to live here, but they don't have strong walls in which to live in. So the question becomes, is this a karpaf? Now, normally, what do we say? A karpaf, that's hukaf, it has mechitzot, but it's not hukaf for living purposes. Remember, we said if it's bigger than a beit sa'atayim, we're going to call it a karmelit. So likewise, here we're going to say these weak mechitzot work up until a beit sa'atayim shiur. Now here it's different because people are planning to live there, but because they're weak mechitzot, they're not proper walls, we're only going to treat them as walls if it's a shetach, a space of a beit sa'atayim. Any bigger than that, no. And the assumption is you're there to camp. How much space do an average person need? He needs 2 sa'atayim. Once you have 3 people in a space, we already say, if you remember, this is called a shayara. It's like a caravan of people, and we give them as much as they need. Okay, basically we give them more than Beit Sa'atayim. Okay, once you're a lot of people, you get to have not just Beit Sa'atayim per person, but you get even more. Okay, so the whole question is going to be in our situation, we're going to say people made mechitzot, but they're in, it's kind of like our courtyards. They're in separate areas. You can already see from the picture if you're looking at the picture. If not, I'm going to explain it in a minute, but we're going to have a certain formation of 3 people who each build walls around their area, but they connect. Okay, we're going to see you can either say it's like the shape of an H or maybe a capital I with the, if you draw it with the line on top and the line at the bottom. So here we're going to read inside. Amar Rav Yehuda, Shalosh karpifot. You have 3 karpafs. Zeh b'tzad zeh. They're all right next to each other. V'shnayim achitzonim megufafim. V'emtzai eino megufaf. So now, instead of 1 ktana open to the big one, we now have 3. So the middle one, we're going to say, is open entirely to both sides. It's what we call nifratz bimlo'o. Okay, it's the middle of the H or the I, right? It's that space where if you're standing in the middle, you don't see any walls going out to the other 2 sides. But the 2 sides each have walls. When you look from the top of the, right, if you're looking for, let's do the eye. It's just a little easier to visualize. You're in the top of the eye or the bottom of the eye, and you're looking inside, right? Imagine a bubble letter. You'd have to have a bubble eye, right? So you're in the upper part or the lower part. When you look in, right, you see the sides of the eye jutting out. So you have gipufim. And it should say v'yachi b'zeh. You have 1 individual in each one. This is a case of 3 people who are all in one space. Why are they all in one space? Because even though they have these boundaries around each other, this is a classic case of what we just said, that the bigger ones absorb the middle one. So the one on the top of the eye absorbs the middle one, and the one on the bottom of the eye absorbs the middle one. And you basically end up that they all, for all intents and purposes, this is one big space. Okay, so that works. And therefore, it's as if it's all 3 people are in one space, and it's with the border around it, and they get kol tzarkan. Vad. Emtzai migufaf. Okay, now what if the emtzai is migufaf? Ushnayim lachitzonim einam migufafim. What if it's the reverse? Okay, now you have a different shape. I'm trying to think about what I could call the shape. I don't have any good ideas. But if you look at picture 334, you see that it's the reverse. Both the side ones go entirely into the middle one. They're narrower. Okay, but the big one in the middle, right? Someone said maybe a plus sign, right? You could sort of say a plus sign. That's a good one. So the one in the middle juts out, right? That's why good. A plus sign is good. It juts out above and below. Okay. So when you're in the middle of the plus sign and you're looking in, all you see is, right, no walls. But when you're at the top and the bottom part, when you're going in, right, you can see there's walls there. Okay. There's walls from the side. You can see those walls from the side. It's a little different than a plus sign because the plus sign is really the same in every shape. Anyway, right. Someone says the Red Cross symbol or the Swiss flag. Okay. In any case, if you look at the picture 334, it will be very helpful. So now that one, what's the problem here? So and again, you have one person each one. Now we have a problem because the middle one absorbs the side one and the middle one absorbs the other side one, but separately, right? In other words, in the other one, we had each big one on the side absorb the middle. So the middle was common ground to everybody. Here, we don't have a space. The middle absorbs that and the middle absorbs that, but they don't absorb the middle. So basically the middle can be in charge there and the middle can be in charge there, but they don't all have a shared space in the center. So therefore they're not viewed as together and each one only gets a Beit Sa'atayim. Ibailu. So now they ask the following, and that's based on our principle about the one that has Gipufim absorbs the other. So now they ask the following question. This is a classic Gemara, I would say a bit of a nudniki question, or not necessarily nudniki, but getting into real detail. What if there's one on either side? But shnayim ba'emtzai. Let's say there's 2 people in the middle. So what do you need? You need 3 people to be together. So do you say mahu ilahacha nafka tzlatahavu ilahacha nafku tzlatahavu? In other words, the 2 people in the middle, if they absorb person on the left side, or they absorb the person on the right side, either which way they're going to be 3 people. So there you have it, right? They can basically take over one side or the other side. O Dilma, or do you say chad lahacha nafik v'chad lahacha nafik? No, it could be theoretically, each person, they'll split. One will say, oh, I want to be more with that guy. And the other one will say, I want to be more with that guy. And then you'll end up with 2 and 2, and you won't have 3 anywhere. So which way do we go? We don't end up with an answer. Then they say, let's say you say they split. What about this case? What if there's 2 in the side and 2 in the other side? 1 in the middle. Do you say, do you say, no matter which way he goes, right? He has control over either the left or the right if he wants. So he can be, if he's with the left, he'll end up with 3. And if he's in the right, he'll end up with 3 because they each have 2 on the sides. Oh, Dilma, or could you say, you could say, since he could go either way, we don't know. It's not definitive which way he's going to go. Therefore, we can't view him as attached to any one of them, in which case we don't have 3 together. So, or of course, the Gemara doesn't answer this question because it's a classic question that the Gemara doesn't have answers for. But then the Gemara paskins, even though we don't have an answer, we go lenient in this case because, again, Eruvin is always lenient. Some people actually say, why does he even tell us that? If we always go leniently in Eruvin, then we don't even need them to tell us this. But in any case, the Gemara tells you we're lenient in this case, and therefore we'll assume that he can join with them, in which case they get more than Beit Sa'atayim. Amar Rav Chisda. Now we're moving on to a new case. Gidud chamisha u'mechitza chamisha ein mitztarfin ad shiu o kulo b'gidud o kulo b'mechitza. Let's say, okay, I have this with my neighbor. I happen to be lower down than my neighbor. The street goes up where my neighbor is, and he's on a much higher plane than I am. Actually, significantly higher. But let's say it's a little bit higher. His is 5 tvachim higher, and mine is 5 tvachim lower, right, obviously. And then there's a mechitza of 5 in between. So you end up with a barrier of 10 in between us. So according to Rav Chisda, no, that doesn't count as a mechitza. Why? It has to be okulo b'gidud, okulo b'mechitza. You can't join embankment, right? This is like an embankment, they call it. You can't join an embankment or a raising of the ground with a mechitza. Those 2 don't join to count as your 10. Meitive, but now we're going to bring a question. What do you mean? It says in the following Braita. Okay, we're going to have a question for the Braita, and we're going to bring 3 different possible answers. Each one's going to be rejected till we get to the final one. Okay, exactly our case. We have 2 courtyards, one above the other. Okay, by the way, before he was talking just in general. Didn't necessarily have to be 2 courtyards. He was just talking about, Rav Chisda was saying, anytime you want to call something a mechitza for whatever purposes you need a mechitza, it can't be mechitza of 5 joined with an embankment of 5. Okay, it doesn't work that way. So comes the Braita, and the Braita says, let's say you have 2 courtyards. Okay, let's say like my neighbor, where his is more than 10 tvachim above mine. Or our case, okay, in between the 2, okay, this is picture number 336. You have the lower one is the one you see in the front here. There's now a gidud. It goes up 5. And then there's a mechitza at a height of 5 from the upper person's ground. Ma'arvin shnayim ve'ein ma'arvin echad. In this case, that counts as a wall. They're separate. If they're separate, what does that mean? We can each make our own separate eruvs, but we can't make an eruv together because there's a mechitza of 10 in between us. This goes exactly against what Rav Chisda said, because Rav Chisda said that doesn't count for mechitza and a gidud, and this says it does. Well, and more so, the Braita continues, pachot mikan, if it's less than that though, ma'arvin echad ve'ein ma'arvin shnayim. If it's less than 5 mechitza, even if the gidud is 5, let's say you end up altogether of 8. Well, obviously, if it's 8, it's as if it's parutz, right? There's no mechitza, there's no wall. Therefore, they can only make an eruv together because this is one big space, because there's no separation between them, and they can't make separate eruvs. So Amar Rava. Rava tries to explain how does Rav Chisda work in with this Braita. Modeh Rav Chisda b'tachtona. We're going to say Rav Chisda says it doesn't work. Who doesn't it work for? It doesn't work for the upper one. Why doesn't it work for the upper one? Because when the upper one's sitting in his courtyard, what does he see? He sees a mechitza of 5. He doesn't see the gidud because his ground is higher. So for the upper one, it doesn't work. But for the lower one, notice I'm on the lower part. I see that whole big barrier between me and my neighbor. My neighbor sits on a higher level. He doesn't even see my courtyard, right? I'm below him. He doesn't even notice the distance between me. He doesn't even see it. But I see the big difference in height. So Modeh Rav Chisda b'tachtona, I see 10. What's the difference if it's gidud or mechitza? It's all together. I see 10. But then they say, no, you can't say that because what should it have said in the Braita? Tachtona ta'arev shnayim velo ta'arev echad. Right? So the tachtona, since I see it, therefore I have a wall, I can only make an eruv separately. I can't make an eruv together. But the Elyona, what's the problem? The Elyona, from the perspective of the upper one, they can't make an eruv with me because I can't make an eruv with them. So that's not an option. But they can't make an eruv by themselves because they're open entirely to me from their perspective. So therefore, it just said in the Braita that Marvin Shnayim ve'em Marvin Echad, they can't make an eruv together. But it should have said Elyona lo ta'arev lo echad lo shnayim. The upper ones can't make an eruv not by themselves and not with me. It doesn't say that in the Braita. So that doesn't make sense to say that's what the Braita is talking about. Second answer. Amar Rabba Bar Ula, he changes the scenario. He says there must be something missing here because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So look at picture 337. What he says is, Kigon shaital yona megufefet ad eser amot. Yes, there's a gidud of 5 and there's a wall of 5, but that's for a space of up to 10 cubits. Past 10 cubits, what happens? There's actually a higher wall. In other words, between me and my neighbor, at some section of the wall, okay, there's 10 height of, okay, there's things on the side, okay, of 10 tfachim. So therefore, it's megufefet ad eser amot. So now, why is it important ad eser amot? Remember, any 10 cubits or less is considered an opening. So now let's see what happens here. So the lower one basically has this wall of 10. Okay, so they can't make a mechitza, right? That makes sense. It says in the Mishnah, Marvin Shnayim ve'em Marvin Echad. They can't make an eruv, They can't make an eruv together because it's a mechitza. The upper one also can, now why is the upper one allowed to make their own mechitza? Because on the sides, there's a space where there's 10 tefachim of wall. So therefore, they can, because of the gifufim, and because the opening is only up to 10 cubits, anything up to 10 cubits, we call an opening and not a pirtza. It's not like it's ruined and open entirely. It's got an opening. So whenever there's 2 courtyards with an opening in between them, but a wall of 10, what do we say? If they want, because there's an opening, they can make an eruv together. If they want, they can't make an eruv together, right? If they want, they can make separate eruvin. So that's what we're going to say here. So if the Elyonam is megufefet ad eser amot, that explains. So what the Braita say? The Braita said, if you have this, Marvin Shnayim ve'em Marvin Echad. Now, the reason here they can't make an eruv together is because from the perspective of the bottom one, there's a 10 tefachim high mechitza. But from the perspective of the upper one, theoretically, they could have made a mechitza, an eruv together. They just can't because it's too high from the other one's side. In other words, it takes 2 to tango. They can theoretically make a mechitza, but not if the other ones can't. So now they say, wait, but something doesn't make sense. If there's gipufim of 10 amot, so then the continuation, and it's only this part where it's 5 and 5 is only a space of up to 10. Well, then the seifa of this Braita doesn't make sense. If it's less than 5, right, we have 5 gidud, 5 tfachim mechitza in the inner part. So let's say it was less than that. Okay, so here, let's move to the next picture. If it's less than 10, then what did we say? Pachomikan in the Braita, Marvin Echad, they can make an eruv together, ve'em Marvin Shnayim. Now, it doesn't make any sense. Ibaya chad ta'arev, ibaya trei ta'arev. Since we have these gipufim on the side, they create a mechitza with an entranceway. We should be able to do a mechitza. We should be able to make our own separate eruv. And this says, once it's less than 10, it's considered open entirely. And it shouldn't be, because if it's less than 10 high, but only up to 10 cubits, and beyond that, we have these gipufim, then that's a perfect mechitza, and that should allow us, right? It's a mechitza with an opening. Doesn't matter how high or low the opening is, we should be allowed to be considered separate because we have these gipufim. And this says you can only make an eruv together. So that doesn't work either. So our third answer is going to build on our second answer. Amar Rabba b'rei de Rava. So he's going to assume there are gipufim, but if you look at picture number 338, these are going to be his gipufim. They're a little bit different. How are they different? Notice picture number 337, where there's gipufim on the side, right? As if it's just part of the wall goes up higher. In picture number 338, it's a classic case of the walls are made up from the houses, okay, or from some sort of wall in the courtyard, but you can only see them from one side, okay? It's going to be just like our Mishnah, where from one perspective, from the lower perspective, you're going to basically view it as if you can't see the gipufim at all. Okay, you have no view of it. Whereas from the upper courtyard, you can see the gipufim on the side. So he says, it's a case where the lower courtyard, basically, once we're trying to figure out the seifa, because that was our problem. Once the mechitza and the gipufim, the mechitza and the gidudim, the height, right, the height differential plus the wall is less than 10, we're already going to say that's considered parutz. You can only make an eruv together. So now they're going to say, well, from whose perspective is it parutz? From the lower one, because, right, the lower one is entirely, they don't see the gipufim on the side. Only the upper one sees it. So from the lower one's perspective, it's entirely parutz. They don't see those walls, and that's why they can only make an eruv together. So then they say, again, we have the same problem as before. Ihachi tachtona, and it's the same type of problem, which is the bright is only referring to one courtyard and not the other. Because what's the law? If it's parutz legamri le'elyona, but the elyona sees the gipufim, then theoretically, how does that work? The bottom one can't make a mechitza. Sorry, I keep confusing the terms. Can't make an eruv by themselves because they're parutz entirely open to the other one. But the upper one has the gipufim. They see a 10 tvachim high wall. So they can get into the other side. They have a wall. So they can make their own eruv. So therefore, it should say, Hachi tachtona chad tarev treto lo tarev. The tachtona is only one choice. They can only make an eruv together because they're considered parutz. But the elyona, the upper one, ibaya tre to arev, ibaya chad to arev. The upper one can have a choice. They could say, well, there's an opening to you, so we can go through to you and make an eruv together. But we also have these parts on the side that are 10 tefachim high that we see from ours, even though you don't see it from yours. And we can therefore see it. We can therefore say we have a wall. We can make our own eruv. So if that's really true, this answer, then the Braita should have said that. And the Braita only really gave us the perspective of the lower one. So the Gemara simply answers, Inachinami, you could still say that. Once it's lower, it's considered entirely parutz, and you can't make an eruv by yourself. That's talking atachtona. They were referring to the lower one, and that's how they resolved the issue. So that the Braita was only talking about from the perspective of the lower one. So now, what do we have? We started with a question on Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda said you can't have gidud and chamisha mechitza chamisha. We said the Braita says you can. In the end, we say the Braita is not relying on that as the mechitza. That's the part where there's an opening or not an opening. What they're talking about is when there's a gipufim on the side, in which case the Braita doesn't contradict Rav Chisda at all. But now the Gemara is going to bring someone who disagrees with Rav Chisda. Darish Meremar, gidud chamisha mechitza chamisha mitzdarfim. He thinks you can join them together. And Eshkached is a very strange line of the Gemara. It's really strange in terms of why the Gemara is even telling us this. Eshkached Ravina le Rav Acha berei de Rava. He found him on the street or somewhere, and he asked him the following question: Amar le Tanam Armidim mechitza. Do you know anything about mechitza? I assume he means about mechitza and gidud. Amar le lo. He says, no, I don't really know anything about it. Okay, why they bring that? He asked him the question. You know the answer. I'm not really sure because we don't get anywhere with this. But in any case, the Gemara tells us hilchata gidud chamisha mechitza chamisha mitzdarfim. In the end, we say they do join together. Okay, last question for today. By Rav Hoshaya, diurin habaim b'Shabbat ma'u sheyasru. What if new people come to our courtyard on Shabbat? Can they forbid us? Or let's say I was in my courtyard, you were in your courtyard. We had a wall between us, so we each made our own mechitza, and then the wall broke in the middle of Shabbat. Now we're parutz. Theoretically, does that cancel out our eruv? Okay, so what's the story? So they say, oh, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Tashma, Amar Rav Chisda, Tashma, let's learn it from our Mishnah. Chatzer gdola shenifritza l'ktana, gdola muteret u'ktana asura. What do you see? The lower one becomes forbidden. Now they're assuming, even though we didn't discuss this until now, they're assuming, right? And it says, Mipnei shekipitcha shel gdola. So they're assuming that what? It's even if it happened on Shabbat. The Mishnah is referring to if it's nifritzai, all of a sudden the wall opened up, even on Shabbat. So Amar Rabba says, what do you mean? You could claim maybe the Mishnah is only talking about if it happened before Shabbat and not if it happened on Shabbat. What's the logic either way? If you say, remember we say, kevan shu'utra, if it was all set up before Shabbat, even though something changed, we already allow it because when Shabbat started, it was allowed. So that's basically what Rabbi is saying. Rabbi is saying it only changes its status. You can say the Mishnah is referring to if it broke before Shabbat. But if it broke on Shabbat and you had your Eruv before and the other one had their Eruv before, everyone can continue to carry where they wanted, or even if only one had an Eruv, they could still continue to carry, even though all of a sudden there's people who are now, right, their Chatzer is no longer separate from the other. So here Abaye has an interesting reaction. With this, we'll finish for today. Amale Abaye, lo amar, imar. Why did you say, let's suggest that the Mishnah is talking about that it happened before Shabbat? He's saying, Ela vaday mi ba'od yom nifritza. It's clear that you hold. And you can't suggest it, maybe. It's obvious that that's the case. Why is it so obvious? Because Daha Marhu, you, Rabba, remember the relationship Abaye and Rabba was his adoptive father. Abaye says, I know, Rabba, you already said to someone, Da'amar, you already said the following. Ba'mi name Rav Huna. I asked this question of Rav Huna, Ba'mi name Rav Yehuda, and he asked Rav Yehuda, and here was the question, Irev derech hapetach, v'nistama petach. Irev derech hachalom, v'nistama chalom. What if we made an Eruv based on the fact that we had an opening between us? And then on Shabbat, the opening got sealed up. What's the halacha? So this is, again, the exact same thing. Change of status doesn't affect things. It's the opposite direction. But, Ma'u v'amarli, and what did you say? You told me that he told you, Shabbat kevan she'utra utra. Since it was permitted in the beginning of Shabbat, it's permitted for the rest of Shabbat. So he basically says to Rabba, why did you say, let's suggest that the Mishnah? It's obvious that the Mishnah, because elsewhere you said that that's the case. And what we're going to pick up from tomorrow is there's going to be a machloket Rav and Shmuel about, do we say kevan she'utra utra, or do we not say that? Or do we say change of status actually affects things on Shabbat? Okay, we'll pick up with that tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.